In 1942, Japanese intelligence officers gathered in a secure facility in Tokyo to review intercepted American military communications from the Pacific Theater. Japan's cryptographic services were among the best in the world, having successfully broken numerous Allied codes throughout the war. They had decoded American, British, and Chinese encrypted messages, giving Japanese commanders valuable intelligence about Allied plans and troop movements. But recently, something strange had appeared in intercepted transmissions. Instead of encrypted English messages that could be decoded using standard cryptographic methods, Japanese radio operators were hearing what sounded like an unfamiliar language, spoken rapidly and with tonal qualities their linguists couldn't identify. The recordings were played and replayed for Japan's best codebreakers and linguists. No one could determine what language was being spoken, much less what the messages meant. Japanese commanders initially assumed this was a temporary measure, perhaps the Americans using translators to communicate with indigenous allies in some remote location. But the mysterious language kept appearing in communications across the Pacific Theater. It was heard at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Saipan. Everywhere American forces were operating. Japanese intelligence concluded that Americans had adopted some form of primitive tribal communication as a desperate measure after realizing their sophisticated codes had been compromised. The assessment among Japanese officers was that this represented American weakness rather than strength. They were resorting to using backwards Indian languages because their modern cryptographic systems had failed. It was almost insulting that Americans thought this would work. Japanese cryptographers had broken the most complex codes European powers could devise. Did Americans really think that having Indians speak their tribal dialects would stop Japanese intelligence? What Japanese intelligence didn't understand was that they were hearing Navajo, a language spoken by a Native American nation in the southwestern United States, and that the Americans had developed not just a language barrier, but a sophisticated military code built on top of that language. The Navajo Code Talkers program had been created specifically because someone in American military intelligence understood something the Japanese didn't. The Navajo language was so unique, so unlike any language known to Japanese linguists, that it would be literally impossible to decode code without native speakers, and even if the Japanese somehow captured a Navajo speaker, they still wouldn't be able to understand the military code that had been layered on top of the language. The system was cryptographically brilliant precisely because it combined linguistic isolation with traditional code structure. The origins of the Navajo Code Talker program contained bitter irony that would not be lost on the Navajo men who participated. For decades, the United States government had pursued policies designed to eliminate Native American languages and cultures. Native American children had been forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their native languages. The goal was forced assimilation, erasing indigenous cultures and making Native Americans into English-speaking citizens who had abandoned their heritage. Navajo children had been beaten for speaking Navajo, had their mouths washed out with soap for using their own language, had been told repeatedly that their language was worthless, savage, something to be ashamed of and abandoned. By 1940, after decades of these policies, many Native American languages were endangered or extinct, and Navajo, while still spoken on the reservation, was discouraged and stigmatized. Then came World War II and Pearl Harbor, and suddenly the same government that had tried to destroy native languages desperately needed them. Philip Johnston, the son of missionaries who had grown up on the Navajo reservation and spoke Navajo fluently, proposed to the Marine Corps that Navajo could be used as the basis for an unbreakable code. His argument was simple. Navajo was an incredibly complex language with tonal qualities and grammatical structures completely unlike any language in Europe or Asia. There were fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the world who could speak it fluently, and most of those were missionaries and traders who lived on the reservation. The Japanese had no linguists who knew anything about Navajo, had no reference materials for studying it, and would find the language completely impenetrable. If a military code was built on top of the Navajo language, it would be effectively unbreakable. The Marine Corps was skeptical, but desperate enough to try anything that might provide secure communications. In May 1942, 29 Navajo recruits were brought to Camp Elliott in California to develop and test the code. These young men, most barely out of their teens, were given an extraordinary assignment: create a military code using their native language that could be used for rapid communication in combat conditions. They had to develop Navajo words for military terms that didn't exist in their language. How do you say tank in Navajo when the Navajo had never seen tanks? How do you say submarine, or bomber, or artillery in a language that had developed in the desert Southwest thousands of years before such things existed? The solution was creative and clever. They used Navajo words that were descriptive. A tank became tortoise in Navajo, a submarine became iron fish, a bomber became buzzard, fighter planes were hummingbirds, battleships were whales. But the code was more sophisticated than just translating military terms into Navajo. The code talkers created an alphabet system where each letter could be represented by multiple Navajo words, making frequency analysis impossible. The letter A might be ant in one message, apple in another message, and axe in a third message, all using different Navajo words. Military terms often had code words that were used instead of the descriptive terms, adding another layer of encryption. Commanders were war chiefs. America was our mother. Allies were those we fight alongside. The code was both a language barrier and a sophisticated cryptographic system, and it worked brilliantly. The 29 original code talkers memorized hundreds of terms, practiced transmitting and receiving messages, and demonstrated they could encrypt, transmit, and decrypt messages faster than machines could. Where existing encryption devices took 30 minutes to process a message, code talkers could do it in 20 seconds. The Marine Corps brass were impressed enough to authorize recruitment of more Navajo code talkers. Young Navajo men, hearing that their language and their people were needed for the war effort, enlisted at rates higher than any other demographic group in America. They came from the reservation where poverty was endemic, where opportunities were limited, where the government that now wanted their help had spent decades trying to destroy their culture. They came anyway because when America was threatened, they chose to defend it despite everything. Many were teenagers who lied about their age to enlist. Some left school to join the Marines, others left families and jobs. They went through Marine boot camp, which was brutal for everyone, but especially challenging for young men from the reservation who had never been far from home. Then they went through Code Talker School, memorizing the code, practicing until they could transmit and receive flawlessly under pressure. Japanese intelligence officers, still trying to break what they now understood was some kind of Native American language code, pursued every avenue they could think of. They captured recordings of code talker transmissions and had their best linguists analyze them. They tried to identify which Native American language was being used by comparing the recordings to samples of various tribal languages. They attempted frequency analysis to find patterns in the transmissions. They consulted with academics who had studied Native American cultures. Nothing worked. The language didn't match anything in their reference materials. The tonal qualities suggested it might be related to some Asian language families, but that led nowhere. There were no repeated patterns that might indicate code structure. Every analytical approach failed completely. For Japanese cryptographers accustomed to breaking codes, this was frustrating and baffling. Codes were supposed to have weaknesses that could be exploited through intelligence and persistence. This code appeared to have no weaknesses at all. The first major test of the code talkers came at Guadalcanal in late 1942 and early 1943. The battle for Guadalcanal was brutal, with Marines fighting to hold Henderson Field against determined Japanese attempts to retake the island. Communications were critical, and the code talkers proved invaluable. They transmitted coordinates for artillery fire, relayed intelligence about Japanese positions, passed orders between units, all while under fire and under conditions that would have made using encryption machines impossible. The code worked perfectly. Messages were transmitted and received accurately. Nothing was intercepted and decoded by Japanese forces, and the speed of communication gave American commanders a significant advantage. Officers who had been skeptical about using Native Americans for such critical work became believers when they saw how effectively the system worked. The code talkers deployed to every major Marine operation in the Pacific. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. Code talkers were there transmitting messages under fire. They operated radios in command posts, in forward observation positions, aboard ships providing fire support. They worked around the clock during major operations, sometimes transmitting hundreds of messages in a single day with zero errors. The reliability was extraordinary. In combat, where stress and fatigue degraded everyone's performance, the Code Talkers maintained perfect accuracy because they were using their native language, something so deeply ingrained that they could function even when exhausted or scared. A Code Talker under artillery bombardment, hands shaking, ears ringing from explosions, could still transmit flawlessly in Navajo because speaking his native language required no conscious thought. Japanese forces made a breakthrough in late 1942 that they thought would solve the code problem. They captured a Navajo soldier named Joe Kieyumia during the fall of the Philippines. Kieyumia was not a code talker. He was just a soldier who happened to be Navajo, but the Japanese didn't know that. When they discovered he was Navajo, Japanese intelligence officers were elated. Finally, they had someone who could explain the code, who could translate the intercepted messages, who could give them the breakthrough they needed. Kieyumia was brought to intelligence officers who played recordings of Code Talker transmissions and demanded he translate them. He listened and told his captors truthfully that he had no idea what was being said. The Japanese didn't believe him. They assumed he was refusing to cooperate, that his loyalty to America was preventing him from helping them. They began interrogating him more forcefully. The interrogation of Kieyumia became torture. He was beaten, burned, subjected to water torture, and told that the pain would stop as soon as he translated the messages. But Kieyumia genuinely could not help them even if he had wanted to. He could hear that the transmissions were in Navajo, could recognize some words, but the military code terms meant nothing to him because he had never been trained as a code talker. When he tried to explain this, his captors thought he was lying. They couldn't comprehend that a Navajo wouldn't understand Navajo code. From their perspective, it would be like capturing an English speaker who claimed not to understand English messages. It seemed obviously false, proof that the prisoner was holding out. The torture continued for weeks. Kieyumia survived through extraordinary endurance, maintaining truthfully that he couldn't translate messages he genuinely didn't understand. Eventually, Japanese intelligence concluded either that he had superhuman pain tolerance or that the code was not really a code at all, but meaningless gibberish designed to confuse them, while real messages were sent through other channels. This conclusion, that the Navajo transmissions were meaningless diversion rather than real coded messages, gained traction among some Japanese intelligence analysts. It seemed to make more sense than the alternative, which was that a code existed that they absolutely could not break. They rationalized their failure by deciding the Americans were being clever, using fake transmissions to waste Japanese intelligence resources while actual military communications went through other channels. This self-deception allowed Japanese intelligence to save face, but it also meant they stopped taking the Navajo transmissions seriously as a cryptographic challenge. They had convinced themselves the problem wasn't real, which meant they stopped trying to solve it. American code talkers could operate with even greater confidence, knowing that Japanese forces weren't seriously attempting to intercept and decode their messages anymore. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945 demonstrated the code talkers' value at their peak effectiveness. 6 code talkers worked around the clock for the first 48 hours of the invasion, transmitting and receiving over 800 messages without a single error. 800 messages in 2 days, all transmitted in combat conditions, all decoded accurately, all contributing to the coordination that allowed Marines to establish the beachhead despite horrific casualties. The code talkers operated from command posts that were under artillery fire, transmitted while exhausted from days without sleep, maintained focus while watching friends die around them. The mental discipline required was extraordinary. They were using their native language, which felt natural, but translating military English into Navajo code terms, transmitting under pressure, receiving incoming messages and translating back to English, all while terrified and exhausted. One error, one mistranslation could send artillery fire onto friendly forces or misdirect reinforcements. The pressure was immense, and the code talkers never failed. Japanese forces on Iwo Jima listening to American radio traffic and hearing the Navajo transmissions, had no idea what they were hearing. Some Japanese soldiers who got close enough to American positions to hear code talkers speaking thought they were hearing some form of magic or ritual, not military communication. The sounds didn't match any language they knew, the tonal qualities seemed almost musical. And the fact that Americans would transmit such messages openly, without apparent concern about interception, suggested to some Japanese soldiers that this must be psychological warfare, designed to unnerve defenders with strange, incomprehensible sounds. The idea that this was actually sophisticated military communication in an unbreakable code didn't occur to soldiers in foxholes who had no context for understanding what they were hearing. They just knew the Americans seemed to coordinate better than should be possible, seemed to always know where Japanese positions were, seemed to call artillery fire with uncanny accuracy. The code talkers were providing that coordination, but to Japanese defenders, American effectiveness seemed almost supernatural. The code talkers themselves were under constant threat not just from Japanese forces, but from their own side. In the chaos of combat, American soldiers sometimes mistook Navajo code talkers for Japanese soldiers because their features and skin tone could look Asian to Americans, who weren't paying close attention. Several code talkers were nearly killed by fellow Americans who thought they were enemy soldiers. The Marine Corps assigned bodyguards to code talkers partly to protect them from capture, but also to prevent friendly fire incidents. The bodyguards were usually white Marines who stayed close to code talkers and vouched for them if questions arose. This was both protective and insulting, a reminder that even while serving their country, Navajo Marines faced discrimination and suspicion. They were valuable assets who had to be protected against their own side's racism, even while they were helping win battles. The families of code talkers back on the Navajo reservation had no idea what their sons and brothers were doing. The code talker program was classified at the highest level. Code talkers couldn't tell their families what their actual role was. Letters home had to be vague. When code talkers received Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat, their families knew they were in danger, but didn't know the specifics. This secrecy continued after the war ended. Code talkers were told that the code was still classified because it might be used in future conflicts, and they were ordered not to discuss their role. They came home from the war, were discharged, returned to the reservation, and had to keep silent about what they had done. They couldn't share their experiences with family, couldn't talk about their service with other veterans, couldn't receive recognition for their contribution. Many code talkers struggled with this enforced silence, carrying memories of combat that they couldn't discuss with anyone who would understand. The code remained classified until 1968, when it was finally declassified after military planners concluded it was no longer needed. Even then, recognition for code talkers was slow in coming. There was a general lack of awareness about what they had accomplished. Hollywood made movies about World War II that ignored Native American contributions entirely. History books mentioned code talkers in passing, if at all. The men who had created and used the only unbreakable code in military history were largely forgotten outside their own community. Some code talkers died without ever receiving public recognition for their service. Others lived into old age still not understanding why their contribution had been ignored for so long. The secrecy that had protected the code during wartime became a barrier to acknowledgement afterward. And the general indifference of American society to Native American contributions made the situation worse. Japanese veterans and military historians, writing about the Pacific War in the decades after 1945, consistently identified the Navajo Code as the only American code they never broke. Japanese cryptographers, interviewed for historical research, acknowledged that the Navajo transmissions had completely defeated their best efforts. They described trying every technique they knew, consulting every expert available, spending thousands of hours analyzing recordings, and achieving absolutely nothing. One Japanese cryptographer said that breaking the Navajo Code would have required either capturing a trained code talker who was willing to explain the entire system, or somehow having advanced knowledge of both the Navajo language and the specific military code built on top of it. Since neither was possible, the code remained unbreakable. This admission from Japanese sources, from cryptographers who had successfully broken every other allied code they encountered, represented validation of what the code talkers had accomplished. The linguistic sophistication of Navajo as a basis for military code was something Japanese cryptographers only understood in retrospect. Navajo is a tonal language where the same word pronounced with different tones has completely different meanings. It has verb conjugations so complex that a single Navajo verb can contain more information than an entire English sentence. The grammar is fundamentally different from Indo-European or Asian language families, making it impossible to decode using techniques that worked on other languages. There are sounds in Navajo that don't exist in Japanese or English, making accurate transcription nearly impossible for non-native speakers. Even the rhythm and flow of spoken Navajo is unique, making it difficult for linguists to know where one word ends and another begins when listening to recordings. All of these linguistic features that made Navajo difficult to learn as a foreign language made it perfect for cryptographic purposes. The Japanese never had a chance of breaking it because they would have needed years just to understand the basic structure of the language. And by then, the war was over. The irony of the American government's treatment of Native Americans before and after the Code Talker program was not lost on the Navajo. Before the war, their language was considered worthless, something to be eliminated. During the war, that same language was essential to American victory. After the war, the contribution was classified and ignored. The Navajo men who served as code talkers dealt with this contradiction in different ways. Some were bitter about the lack of recognition and the return to discrimination after military service. Others were philosophical, taking pride in what they had accomplished regardless of whether it was acknowledged. Many simply continued with their lives on the reservation, dealing with poverty and limited opportunities, carrying their wartime experiences privately. The warrior tradition in Navajo culture provided some framework for understanding military service as a duty performed for the people regardless of recognition, but the specific circumstances of Code Talker service, where they had saved American lives using a language America had tried to destroy, created a unique and complex emotional situation. Recognition finally began coming in the 1980s and 90s as historians started documenting the Code Talker program more thoroughly and as public interest in World War II history increased. Code Talkers were invited to speak at schools and military events. They were interviewed for documentaries. Their story began appearing in history books and educational materials. In 2001, the surviving Code Talkers received Congressional Gold Medals, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. The medals were presented in ceremonies that finally, 56 years after the war ended, publicly acknowledged what the Code Talkers had accomplished. Many Code Talkers had died by then, never receiving the recognition they deserved. The survivors who attended the medal ceremonies were elderly men, the youngest in their late 70s, some in wheelchairs, many dealing with health problems. They received standing ovations from audiences who were learning their story for the first time. The last of the original 29 Code Talkers, Chester Nez, died in 2014 at age 93. Nez had enlisted in the Marines at age 16, lied about his age because he wanted to serve, became one of the men who created the code, fought at Guadalcanal and Peleliu and Guam, survived the war, couldn't tell anyone what he had done for 26 years, and finally, in his old age, received recognition as a hero. His funeral was attended by military officials, tribal leaders, and people from across the country who wanted to honor one of the last living Code Talkers. The ceremony included both Marine military honors and traditional Navajo rituals, acknowledging both aspects of his identity. Nez's death marked the end of an era, the passing of the last men who had been there at the beginning when the code was created and first tested. Younger Code Talkers who had been trained later in the war survived, but the original 29 were all gone. The legacy of the Code Talkers influenced American military thinking about diversity and the value of different cultural backgrounds in warfare. The success of the Navajo Code demonstrated that unique cultural knowledge could provide military advantages that technology alone couldn't match. This realization contributed to broader recognition that military effectiveness requires drawing on all of America's human resources, that excluding people because of their race or background meant losing potentially valuable capabilities. The Code Talker program became an argument for diversity in military recruiting and for respecting cultural differences rather than demanding cultural uniformity. The same principle was later applied to recruiting people with rare language skills for intelligence and translation work, building on the lesson that linguistic and cultural diversity provided strategic advantages. The Navajo Nation itself gained pride from the Code Talker legacy. In communities where historical trauma from government oppression and forced assimilation remained raw, the Code Talker story provided a counter-narrative of Navajo contribution and heroism. Young Navajos, growing up decades after the war, could look to the Code Talkers as examples of how their culture and language had value, how Navajo identity was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. Schools on the reservation taught about the Code Talkers, ensuring the story was passed down to new generations. The Code Talker story became part of how the Navajo Nation understood itself and its relationship with the United States, a complicated relationship where historical oppression and wartime contribution existed side by side. The Japanese dismissal of the Navajo Code as primitive or meaningless reflected broader assumptions about indigenous peoples that were common in the 1940s, but that the war helped discredit. Japanese military culture, like most military cultures of that era, assumed that modern technological societies were inherently superior to traditional indigenous cultures, that primitive peoples couldn't contribute meaningfully to modern warfare. The Code Talkers proved this assumption completely wrong. The Navajo language, developed over millennia by people living in the American Southwest, proved more sophisticated and more secure for military communications than anything modern cryptographers could devise. The traditional culture that Japanese and American societies had both dismissed as backwards contained knowledge that proved militarily decisive. This lesson about respecting rather than dismissing indigenous knowledge was largely ignored in the immediate post-war period, but gained recognition in later decades as part of broader reconsideration of how modern societies relate to indigenous peoples. The perfect record of the Navajo Code, 0 messages decoded by Japanese forces throughout the entire war, remains one of the most remarkable achievements in cryptographic history. Modern cryptographers analyzing the code have concluded it was genuinely unbreakable given the resources and knowledge available to Japanese intelligence in the 1940s. Even today, with computers and modern linguistic analysis, breaking the Navajo Code without knowing the language and the military terminology would be extremely difficult. The code combined linguistic isolation, where almost no one outside the Navajo Nation spoke the language, with traditional cryptographic techniques like variable encoding and military terminology. The result was a layered defense where breaking through one layer still left you unable to understand the message. Japanese cryptographers, working with pencil and paper and without any reference materials for the Navajo language, never had a realistic chance of breaking it. The Code Talkers themselves understood, in varying degrees, what they had accomplished. Some realized they had contributed to something historically significant, that their role had been essential to American victory in the Pacific. Others were more modest, viewing themselves as simply having done their duty like millions of other American servicemen. Almost all carried complicated feelings about their service, pride mixed with awareness of how they had been treated before and after the war. They had proven their courage and capability in the most demanding circumstances possible, had saved American lives, had helped win battles, and ultimately win the war. Yet they returned home to a society that still discriminated against Native Americans, that still offered limited opportunities, that treated them as second-class citizens despite their service. This contradiction was painful, and different Code Talkers processed it in different ways over their lifetimes. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers contains multiple lessons that remain relevant decades after World War II ended. It demonstrates that diversity provides strength, that different cultures and languages offer capabilities that homogeneous societies lack. It shows that prejudice and discrimination are not just morally wrong, but strategically foolish, that dismissing people because of their background means losing access to their unique capabilities. It illustrates that indigenous knowledge and languages have value that modern technological societies should respect rather than trying to eliminate. It proves that underestimated people, given opportunity, can accomplish extraordinary things. And it reminds us that the United States, for all its flaws and injustices, at its best has been able to draw on the talents and loyalty of people from all backgrounds to achieve things that seemed impossible. The young Navajo men who created and used the code could have refused to serve a government that had oppressed them, could have decided their loyalty was to their tribe rather than to America. Instead, they chose to defend America despite everything, and in doing so, they proved that their language, their culture, and their people deserved respect and honor. The Japanese commanders who dismissed them as primitive learned, too late to matter that they had completely misunderstood what they were facing. The code that seemed like desperate improvisation was actually cryptographic perfection, and the primitive language was the key to American victory in the Pacific War.